Now that we have discussed the fact that reparations are feasible, given the examples from the first session, along with the historical economic reasons why repair is needed for the descendants of enslaved Black Americans, we will now turn our focus on the legal, moral, and religious reasons we, as Reformed Jews, have been asked to support reparations. The title, A Jewish Perspective, gets to the heart of the matter. I would now like to welcome our guest speakers, Ms. Nkechi Taifa, Rabbi Hannah Goldstein, and Rabbi Jonah Pesner. I'll share with you their bios. Ms. Nkechi Taifa, president of the Taifa Group, LLC, is a senior fellow at Columbia University Center for Justice and convenes the Justice Roundtable, an advocacy coalition advancing progressive justice system transformation. Ms. Taifa has served as Advocacy Director for Criminal Justice at the Open Society Foundation, Legislative and Policy Council for the American Civil Liberties Union, and Women's Legal Defense Fund, and founding director of Howard University School of Law's Equal Justice Program. Ms. Taifa has testified before Congress, the United States Sentencing Commission, DC City Council, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and U.S. Helsinki Commission. She served as an appointed commissioner and chair of the DC Commission on Human Rights. An award-winning attorney, Nkechi Taifa is past president of the DC chapter of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. She is a founding member of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and serves as the commissioner on the National African American Reparations Commission. Ms. Taifa is the author of a new memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. Welcome. Rabbi Hannah Goldstein is Associate Rabbi at Temple Sinai in Washington, D.C., where she is active with the Temple's extensive social and racial justice work. Rabbi Goldstein serves on the Mayor's Interfaith Council of Washington, D.C., and also works closely with Multiracial Sinai, an initiative to guide Temple Sinai in becoming an anti-racist congregation. Ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, where she has also completed a master's in religious education, Rabbi Goldstein is a leader in the Washington Interfaith Network, a multiracial, multi-faith citizens organization advocating for affordable housing, racial equity, and living wage jobs, and is active in campaigns for reproductive justice through the Women of Reform Judaism. And finally, Rabbi Jonah Pesner has led the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism since 2015. Rabbi Pesner also serves as Senior Vice President of the Union for Reform Judaism, where he has been instrumental in guiding the reform movement to become even more impactful as the largest Jewish denomination in the US and internationally. Under his leadership, the RAC has recently launched its racial justice campaign to examine the reform movement's own policies and practices through the lens of racial equity and inclusion, and outwardly to pursue targeted strategic advocacy that could change laws and policies that impact our society. Ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, Rabbi Pesner serves as a board member of Join for Justice, the Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, the New England Center for Children, and the World Faith Development Dialogue. Thank you each for being here and for participating. To start, we will hear from first Rabbi Goldstein and then Ms. Taifa. After their presentations, myself, along with Rabbi Pesner, Rabbi Goldstein, and Ms. Taifa will join in a conversation before getting the questions from you all. So please, as you're thinking of questions, direct your questions through the chat to Lisa Tucker. Thank you again for everyone participating, and I will turn it over to Rabbi Goldstein.
Good afternoon. I know we're on a tight time schedule, but I do want to just thank Deitra for her leadership and for helping make all of this happen. So thank you, Deitra. and multiracial Sinai. I'm humbled and honored to be here. I'm going to talk about a few different dimensions of the Jewish case for reparation, one that's rooted in biblical text, the second that's based in the Jewish notion of teshuvah, and finally, the self-interest of contemporary American Jews. So I share all of this with a great deal of gratitude to the rabbis who have written and spoken out about reparations and who have begun to build the intellectual foundation for this conversation in the Jewish world with their writing and their sermons. The Jewish case for reparation begins in the Torah, and I learned about this from Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, and I really encourage you to read his writing. The beginning of the book of Exodus tells the story of Israelite enslavement and the Israelites' subsequent liberation. It's a story that I think we all know, a cornerstone of Jewish identity, and we repeat it annually at the Passover Seder. But there's an aspect of the story that I certainly did not learn about in religious school, and it's extremely relevant to our topic this afternoon. On 3 occasions, the text of Exodus talks about the Israelites going to their Egyptian neighbors and asking to borrow their valuable silver and gold. The first time we hear this in Exodus, God appears to Moses in the burning bush, calling Moses to lead the people out of slavery. And God explains the plan. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that when you go, you will not go empty, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor and of the one lodging in her house silver items and gold items and clothing, and you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and you shall empty out the Egyptians. When you go, you shall not go empty. This notion appears twice more in the book of Exodus. Now it's the eve of liberation with one more plague to go. God tells Moses, speak, please, in the ears of the people that they ask each man of his neighbor and each woman of her neighbor silver items and gold items. God implores Moses to speak to the people about this issue. And then we read in the next chapter that they did it. The children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they asked of the Egyptians silver items and gold items and clothing, and God gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they gave them what they asked, so they emptied out the Egyptians. As the Israelites prepared to leave Egypt, as they prepared for a new life after slavery, God urged them repeatedly to ask for things of value from the Egyptians, and perhaps with some intervention from God, the Egyptians agreed. This component of liberation and its 3 repetitions demonstrates the essential nature of appealing to the Egyptians for objects of value. It suggests that this is just as much a part of the story as the matzah and the blood on the doorposts of the home. You shall not go empty. Our text is suggesting that liberation is not enough. Freedom is not enough. To be freed with no material wealth is in fact dangerous and unethical. So you shall not go empty. You shall be liberated from slavery in Egypt with the silver and gold of Egyptian oppressors to sustain you in the next chapter of your journey. Are these reparations? It's of course an anachronism to call them that, but the principle that underlies these texts is clear. After generations of uncompensated servitude, you shall not go empty. In the American context, there was a flirtation with this notion that you shall not go empty. We know it as 40 acres and a mule, imagined by a group of Black ministers and partially proposed by General William Sherman. He proposed the land, the mule came a little bit later. It was approved by Abraham Lincoln and then overturned by Andrew Johnson. And to this day, we have failed to rectify this. Which brings me to the notion of teshuvah, to the process of turning that we typically associate with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In Judaism, we ritually acknowledge our sins and seek to repair them. The concept of teshuvah both compels us and provides us with the playbook for how to confront our failings. Teshuvah begins with confession, with an acknowledgement of that wrong that you did, of saying it out loud, naming it. In America, it is remarkable how little many of us have learned about slavery. It is remarkable how little many of us have learned about Jim Crow, about segregation, about the deliberate discrimination of people of color in our country, and yet it is an inescapable reality in our country's past and present. There is so much that white Americans in particular do not know about how we got here. To do tshuva is to make a different choice, to speak out loud the murder, theft, and dehumanization that were and are part of the American story. Tshuva is not just about the repair, it's about confronting the truth in all of its ugliness. It is in that confrontation that we begin to see what is owed. In Hilchot Tshuva, Maimonides writing on repentance, we see that repair has two dimensions. One is to compensate the person who has been wronged, to attempt to repair the damage that has been done. And two, Maimonides writes, even if a person restores the money that he owes the person he wronged, he must appease him and ask him to forgive him. Reparations are not just about money, though they are certainly about money and intergenerational wealth. Reparations are about seeking to repair the wrong. If you could snap your fingers and undo the wealth gap today, racism would persist tomorrow. If you listened to last week's session, you heard all of the ways in which systemic inequity continues to plague our country. Doing tshuva means righting those wrongs as well. Finally, tshuva suggests that repair is possible. The US can never rectify the sin of slavery completely. It is in the past, but we can attempt to begin to repay the massive debt that is owed and confront its legacy in our society. I want to speak briefly about German reparations to Jewish victims of the Holocaust as a case study of tshuva in action. The economic reparations are significant in that they happened. I'm a rabbi, not an economist, but German reparations are one example that reparations are possible from an economic perspective. And German reparations are part of a process of tshuva, of confronting historic atrocity. Journalist Jodi Kantor recently shared her family's story. Her grandmother is a Holocaust survivor. She's 97 years old, and she continues to receive a monthly check from the German government, and it says on it, for Schaden, for harm. German reparations were certainly significant for those who received and continue to receive checks in the mail. They were also significant for Germany to engage in a process of confronting and acknowledging the almost unfathomable harm that they committed. And in acknowledging this, they have had to do some real soul searching about their collective identity now and who they want to be as they move forward. And this leads me to my final point. Reparations are necessary for the continued flourishing of American democracy. I would argue that American democracy overall has been good for white American Jews. There are certainly many exceptions, but compared to other places and times in Jewish history, America has been good to us. If we accept that the continuity of stable American democracy is good for the Jews, then I would argue that reparations are critical for all of us. We are a multiracial Jewish community. There are some among us who are descended from slaves impacted by Jim Crow who continue to face racialized discrimination to this day. Certainly reparations are owed. And to attempt to repair the wrongs of our history to enable us to live in a healthy multiracial democracy is in the interest of all Americans. The American project sits precariously on a foundation of injustice and theft. And we know what happens when you build on an unstable foundation. Rabbi Sharon Brous, in her sermon on reparations, cited Rabbi Sholem Noach Berezovsky, a survivor of a Hasidic dynasty that was mostly wiped out in the Holocaust. And she quotes him as saying, "One who builds a home without investing in a deep and pure foundation will inevitably confront cracks on the walls and breaches in the structure. He'll work furiously to paint and plaster over the cracks, desperate to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But at some point, no superficial adjustments will suffice, and the house will be in danger of collapsing. Eventually, the only solution will be to demolish the place, clean out the rotten foundation, and build something new that is strong and healthy. No matter how significant the structure, on an unstable foundation, you will spend your life trying to make repairs, and sometimes it ultimately collapses. The past few years have been riddled with evidence of the ways in which our democracy is weakened by white supremacy. To study reparations means confronting the horrors of American history. In the Jewish community, we are no strangers to the evil we humans are capable of committing. I have found myself so deeply ashamed at what was considered normal and acceptable in America, what continues to be normal and acceptable in America. And to study reparations and to believe in reparations is to reconnect with the belief that repair is possible. It is to harness a profound faith in what America is capable of when we feel a sense of urgency and commitment. It is our responsibility as Jews to educate ourselves and our congregations and our communities about reparations, because the Torah teaches us that you should not go out empty, and because tshuva reminds us that repair is possible, and because I believe that we have an opportunity and an obligation to perfect our deeply imperfect union. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nkechi Taifa.
Wow. Thank you so very much, Rabbi Goldstein, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. That was absolutely and completely powerful. You have floored me. I don't even know if I need to continue. So I just want to say thank you for that. The human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some of the enslaved pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day, in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby or her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. The enslaved were grandmothers and grandfathers, carpenters and blacksmiths, pregnant women and anxious fathers, children and infants who were fearful, bewildered, and despairing as they saw their families and communities ripped apart by the sale of 1838. Some children were sold without their parents, and the enslaved were dragged off by force to the ship. Others ran away before they could be captured. Their panic and their desperation will be mostly forgotten for more than a century. But this was no ordinary sale of enslaved people. The enslaved human beings had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priest, and they were sold, along with scores of others, to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time, known today as Georgetown University. So, what happened to these 272 men, women, and children who were literally sold down the river? And what is owed, if anything, to the descendants of those enslaved and the descendants of the millions of others whose names and circumstances we will never know, who were sold or insured or raped or castrated, lynched, or subjected to gynecological experiments devoid of anesthesia? What is owed, if anything, to the descendants of Africans enslaved in this country whose kidnappings and tortures and uncompensated labor helped to ensure the survival of colleges and universities and banks and corporations and industries and religious institutions and private estates, and yes, the federal, state, and local governments? Thank you, Union for Reform Judaism. Deitra, thank you so very much for inviting me. Rabbis Goldstein and Pesner, thank you for allowing me to share just a few minutes of my opening framing and excerpt, which I just presented from Professor Rachel Swan's article that was published in the New York Times in April of 2016 that chillingly described the sale of 272 enslaved persons to ensure the future of Georgetown University. And I'm pleased to have been asked to speak here today for this sacred dialogue. I just love that term, this sacred dialogue with the Jewish community as we discuss the crime against humanity that was the ma'afa of the enslavement era and its continuing vestiges against Black people. But let's not get it twisted. It was not just the South that bore culpability. My white colleague, Katrina Brown, uncovered evidence that her New England ancestors were the largest slave trading family in US history, that her ancestors brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains. She documented her roots in the Sundance acclaimed film, Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep North, not the South. She stresses that the slave trade was not just a few people taking a boat and sending it out. Everyone in the New England town lived off of slavery. The boat maker, the iron worker who made the shackles, the coopers who made the barrels to hold the rum, the distillers who took the molasses and the sugar and made it into the rum. Literally, the whole town was dependent on the slave trade. Wealth and privilege. Wealth and privilege in the United States, Katrina says, has been amassed in large measure as a direct or indirect consequence of the institution of slavery. And far from being an artifact of history, slavery has a tangible presence today in the American economy. Enslaved labor built the roads, the ports, the rail lines, which remain profit generating today. Slavery is just built into the entire American landscape, still generating wealth. Countless companies and industries benefited and were enriched from the profits made as a result of the trafficking in human beings. There are companies that sold life insurance policies on the lives of enslaved people. Aetna, New York Life, AIG, financial giants were accrued by the predecessor banks of financial giants like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America. Others with documented ties to slavery included railroads, Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, Canadian National. Newspaper publishers that assisted in the capture of runaway persons include Knight Rider, Tribune, E.W. Scripps, Gannett. The financial backers of the country's top universities, including just about every Ivy League university, were wealth slave owners. In the context of Black people in this country, the quest for reparations, for reparatory justice, essentially constitutes 4 elements. Number 1, the formal acknowledgement of historical wrong and an official unfettered apology for the dehumanization and the atrocities of the enslavement era and beyond. And why do I say unfettered apology? Why don't I just say apology? Because the Senate and the House of Representatives did pass symbolic resolutions apologizing for slavery and segregation. However, the 2009 bill passed by the Senate contained a disclaimer that those seeking reparations or cash compensation could not use that apology to support a claim for reparations. The audacity. Number 2, with respect to the 4 elements that I am proffering, the recognition that the injury has continued throughout the years and still manifests today. Number 3, the commitment to redress by the federal government, which sanctioned the enslavement and subsequent segregation, and by state and local governments and other culpable parties which enjoyed unjust enrichment from the era. And number 4, the actual compensation in whatever form or forms are agreed upon. Moreover, the United States must adhere to the 5 internationally accepted norms for reparations, inclusive of the requirements of number 1, cessation and guarantees of non-repetition. Number 2, restitution. Number 3, compensation. Number 4, satisfaction. Number 5, rehabilitation. The spirit of reparations, my brothers and sisters, is sweeping the country. Thank you, Union for Reform Judaism, for adding your voice to the plethora of entities passing resolutions on the issue, which also include the National Council of Churches, United Church of Christ, the Diocese of the Episcopal Church, and more. The Princeton and Virginia Theological Seminaries, as well as the Jesuits, have earmarked monies. The U.S. Conference of Mayors has endorsed Reparations, along with Amalgamated Bank, the Players Coalition of professional athletes and coaches and owners across leagues. Even Ben & Jerry's ice cream has endorsed reparations, okay? The state of California has established a reparations commission. The city of Evanston, Illinois has earmarked monies from its legal cannabis industry to fund reparation initiatives. The city of Chicago passed the reparations ordinance for victims of police torture. Jurisdictions across the country are passing laws to examine the history of the enslavement and its vestiges in their own backyards. Slavery disclosure ordinances have been enacted in 16 jurisdictions, revealing historical ties to the enslavement era from financial institutions. And just this past week, there was a historic hearing in the House of Representatives on the upcoming 100-year anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre, where 107-year-old living survivor, 107 years old, people, Mother Viola Fletcher, came to Washington, D.C., to Congress to testify about the harm she still suffers today as a result of the obliteration of the thriving Black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, also known as Black Wall Street, where Black people lost everything, in addition to the very lives of over 300 Black men, women, and children, but also their homes, their businesses firebombed and burned, their very livelihood snatched. Dead bodies were piled up in the streets or thrown into the Arkansas River, and more than 6,000 Black survivors who escaped with only the clothes on their back were confined in internment camps at the city's convention hall and fairgrounds. The insurance companies refused to pay claims on the mortgages held by Blacks because of the big lie that was perpetrated by officials in the white press, characterizing the race massacre as a riot, which relieved the insurers from having to pay benefits. This one massacre alone prevented perhaps $1 billion in generational wealth, land, businesses, investments, intellectual property from being passed down. In Tulsa was far. It was far, far from the only massacre of Black towns. This casket is just now opening on numerous others, including Rosewood, Florida, Wilmington, North Carolina, Elaine, Arkansas, countless others. We're not taught these facts in schools. I wasn't taught them. You probably weren't taught them either. We were not taught this. In fact, American history has been stripped of these atrocities. And that also is part of the harm that must be addressed. There's one thing I learned from the Jewish experience. No, it was not the more than $70 billion in reparations the German government paid to more than 800,000 Holocaust survivors, or the $7 billion Germany agreed to give to the state of Israel. No, it was the concept that I heard of called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. I never heard of it. I couldn't even pronounce it, epigenetic, whatever. But it was a study that was done of third-generation Holocaust survivors, where researchers found that they had inherited genes that had been transformed as a result of their ancestors' trauma and were becoming more susceptible to anxiety and other disorders. And it was found that the trauma from the Holocaust traveled in the genes, transmitted intergenerationally. And I began to think, African Americans have inherited centuries of trauma as a result, not only of the enslavement era, but also everything else. We really need to open up that casket. If the Jewish Holocaust caused immense emotional, physical, and psychological effects intense enough to cause trauma to survivors all the way down the line intergenerationally, then what is the impact on living African Americans today? due to the abject horrors and brutality and trauma and terrorism of the enslavement era itself, the kidnappings, the forced free labor, the stealing of our languages and culture, the rapes, the breedings, the dismemberments, the brutality, the inhumanity of the Black codes and convict lease labor, the peonage system, the chain gangs, the sharecropping, the lynchings, the harms of Jim Crow apartheid, denial of the benefits of the Homestead Act, the GI Bill, gerrymandering, redlining, educational inequities, health disparities, mass incarceration. And all this for 400 years, or however one wishes to measure the time. All of this still exists. It still exists within the collective genes of Black folk in this country. The harms we have suffered are multifaceted. Thus, the remedies must be as well. Indeed, a reparations settlement should be fashioned in as many ways as necessary to equitably address the countless manifestations of injustice emanating from America's original sin. So I come to a close. We all saw the lynching of George Floyd a year ago. We all saw the January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection. Now we must all see this first step toward atonement, the passage of H.R. 40, the Federal Commission to study and develop reparation proposals, either legislatively or via executive order, as the right remedy. At this time, in this day, reparations is indeed, it is indeed an issue whose time has come. We can wait no longer. Facts must no longer be dismissed, must no longer be ignored, must no longer be swept under the rug. They must be recognized. They must be acknowledged. They must be discussed, and they must be redressed so as to be able to close the shameful era of US history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Taifa. Thank you, Rabbi Goldstein. Rabbi Pesner and I will, it does take a moment just for all of that history, all of that knowledge, all of that, all of those pieces that come together in both our Jewish, I'm speechless in both who we are as Jews, who we are as Americans, who we are as a people. And during your words, I was thinking of my time last weekend. I was at a Jews of Color Shabbaton. It was the national Shabbaton. It was the first one, and it was beautiful to be with Jews of color across the world, actually. And we said Kaddish for George Floyd with his 1-year anniversary coming up. And I'm right now thinking about how this last year we have declared how Black Lives Matter. We have rallied and asked for change. And this change that we're talking about today is such an important part to this repair. I think that the words that Rabbi Goldstein gave us, reconnect, matches the R words that Professor America gave us last week. So we have reconnect, recapture, recoup, recover. And all of those systems, all of the racist systems that we talked about last week, that we talked about this week, I would like to hear from you all about why right now is such an important time to have this conversation and to push for reparations. And maybe if we could start with Jonah Pesner.
I'm honored, Deitra, to follow your great question after those two remarkable presentations. I echo your words of praise and just soaking in Ms. Taifa, Rabbi Goldstein. Wow. I think I speak for 127 people on this Zoom. I was at a meeting of rabbis, I think it was 6 years ago, when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote the seminal article, The Case for Reparations, which was a long form article. I think it was in the Atlantic or the New Republic. I can't remember now where, but people should Google it. And the group of rabbis studied a text from our tradition, very much in the spirit of the text Rabbi Goldstein brought, around our ancestor Abraham. And the parable of Abraham was told that Abraham was journeying and saw a palace on fire. And he looked at the house on fire, the palace on fire, and he said, well, surely there is an owner. And surely this owner of this palace must be calling me to do something. The parable, of course, was the Holy One, God, and the palace is the world. And so Abraham goes on his journey to make the world more just, more compassionate, and more equitable, because he understands that the house is on fire and that we are called to nothing less by the Holy One to hear Miss Taifa's call, to encounter the 400 years of systemic racism, the original sin of slavery. And this group of rabbis studied Ta-Nehisi Coates. They were well aware of what was happening in Ferguson and the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and too many names than we can utter on this Zoom. If we would have a Kaddish list, Deitra, for all of the names that we'd add to George Floyd, the Zoom would last forever. But it was those rabbis who understood the intersection between that thousands-year-old tradition of Abraham and Sarah hearing the call of the Holy One to see the fire burning and to recognize in many ways what Rabbi Goldstein, I think, taught about, that the original sin, if there's that one beam that's rotten, that has caused the palace to be unstable, that has caused this fire to happen, then we have to root it out. So I think, this was a longer answer to, I think, a great, simple, short question, Deitra, but I think those rabbis had that conversation 5-6 years ago and began to do the studying, the building of the political will. It culminated at a moment that you and I and others on this Zoom shared when the Union for Reform Judaism passed its historic resolution calling for reparations. I think we're the first major Jewish denomination in the world to call for reparations for the descendants of African people who have been enslaved and kidnapped from Africa. But I want to say, being as sober and realistic, though it was a kind of, a voice vote, and when the vote was called, thousands and thousands of people said yes. There was a vocal, small, but vocal no. So we have work to do within our Reformed Jewish community and the broader landscape, because I think if we heard anything from Ms. Taifa, this is a fight right now, right? It is now in Congress. It is now in our communities. It is now in our congregations. And so the fight is now. Longer answer, teacher, to a simple question. I apologize.
I just want to add, like, now is too late. Like, now isn't the time. I think I'm ashamed that now is the time, because it's 400 years later than we should have. It is not the right time. This is a time that has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And there are these inklings of American history that show that we kind of knew that all along, and yet never did what we needed to do. And so I think I think this is a moment of conscience in our country. And I think that for a lot of white people, the ability to see, the harm that is still being done on a regular basis, the murder of Black people in our country, is something that we can't look away from. We have no choice. And so maybe that will mean that now is the time, but it was the time a really long time ago. And so I hope and pray that this is the time that we'll act, and that we will have enough will to actually make something happen, but it's not the right time. It's far too late.
I agree with what both of my colleagues have said. I personally started working on this issue when I was 16 years old. I'm in the 6th decade of my life now. So it's been a long, long time. I remember when the Japanese American Redress Bill, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, was passed, which granted reparations to Japanese Americans, for the the situation dealing with World War II. And that's when we decided to form the organization in COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And it's been, we're going on 33 years now. And the bill that John Conyers introduced, which we work closely with him, HR 40, in remembrance of that failed campaign promise of 40 acres. And like you said, the mule came later. We have come further within the past couple of years than we've come in the 30 years before that time. We have more co-sponsors for HR 40 than we have ever had. We have a Senate companion bill, something that we have never had. This is an issue whose time has come. There is a reckoning on race going on in the country right now. We must not let this moment pass. There's so many more entities who are coming on board. Some people are writing me direct messages. Maybe you should put it to everybody, but wanting to know about Georgetown. And yes, they have earmarked $100 million. But another group that I'm with called the National African American Reparations Commission says no amount of monetary compensation can ever completely compensate for what has gone through. So we're talking about a negotiated settlement. That's what we're talking about. And we're not talking about something that an entity says, okay, well, we did wrong and we're going to give you this. No, it has to be something that comes from the injured parties themselves. The victims must have a say in just what the resolution, is going to be. So anyway, now is the time. We're flying this plane while we're building it. I keep saying that because I must admit, I do not have all the answers. I'm looking to history. I'm looking to the Holocaust. I'm looking to what's happening in other places around the world and what has happened before. But each situation is unique. It really is. And I put forth the term, I don't know if any of you all knew what it was when I mentioned the ma'afa of the enslavement of Africans. That was our Holocaust. We call it the ma'afa, because we need our own languages and our own terms and our own definitions, because that is part of the self-determination that is critical, as we are, redefining our humanity. So anyway.
Thank you. The ma'afa. The ma'afa. And I believe Rabbi Pesner has a question.
I'd love to ask 2 questions, one to Ms. Taifa and one to you, Deitra, if I may. To Ms. Taifa, you alluded to Oklahoma as one good example. There are countless. Today's New York Times told the story about the Farm Bill, which is seeking to have billions of dollars to Black farmers. No surprise, though there are I think it was 2 to 5 or 8% of all farmers in America are Black. In all these rural communities, all the white farmers are outraged and saying it's discriminatory. It just goes on and on and on, the illogic of it. I wonder, as you do this work day in and day out, what are some of the arguments that you can help this audience with when somebody says, well, that's discriminatory, that's reverse racism, which is of course offensive and obnoxious, but what are some language? And then to you, Deitra, if you're willing to reflect a little bit about this question of intergenerational trauma. As a Black Jewish woman who inherits 400 years of trauma from the descendant of African people who were kidnapped and enslaved and lived under Jim Crow, and Jewish intergenerational trauma, how you think about that intersectionality. So for both of you, as you wish.
Yes. Thank you for the question. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the ignorance that we have been inculcated with. Folk do not know about the wholesale removal of Black farms. They don't know about people were just stripped of land. One of the reasons why there are a lot of Black folk in the North now, because they fled the South, because of the racism, because of the murders, because of the lynchings, literally just had to leave, okay? And they left behind land, or land was stolen, or, you know, there's just so many instances that we don't even know about because they're not part of the history books. We're not taught about any of these things. When I talk about the casket being open, I'm really referring back to 1955, when Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, demanded an open casket for the world to see what America, what racism did to her 14-year-old son, Emmett Till, who was found at the bottom of Mississippi's Tallahatchie River. His whole, I can't even describe what it was like. So hopefully the community knows about that circumstance, but so much has been buried. And we need to open up this casket so that we know all of these things. And what is being given in the Farm Bill for the Black farmer, it really is just a pittance. I mean, it really is just a pittance. In fact, a pittance that should have happened long, long ago anyway in the first place. So it's disingenuous. And I'm not even saying intentionally disingenuous. I honestly feel that if people knew what the history was, they might not be so fast to call reverse discrimination. And I'm not just talking about white people. If you saw the House Judiciary Committee hearing on HR 40 a couple of months ago, Black people themselves, okay, are traumatized. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is part of the harm as well. And are saying some of the same things that other people are saying as well, because I'm sorry, it's just emotional for me, because everything I learned on my own. I was not taught any of this in the schools. And even today, where we're supposed to have come so much further, the history is still not there. We have Hannah Nicole Jones with the 1619 Project being denied tenures precisely because of opposition to her Pulitzer Prize winning information uncovering a lot of these things, you know. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Deitra.
And I'm actually going to also tag on a bit to Rabbi Pesner's question to Ms. Taifa. When I read the headline in the New York Times, actually in the daily briefing this morning, the way the title was framed was also disingenuous, and it shows us how racism works in this country. So the framing was that there would be money given to Black farmers who have struggled financially. The framing was not that Black farmers have been denied for decades and generations federal loans, kicked out of their homes, as Ms. Taifa was just saying. So that's such part of how racism works in this country. We're not, the information isn't presented in a whole fashion in context. And so Black farmers are owed money that they have been denied for years and generations. And so that's the first thing. And then just also thinking of that other system, again, these systems of institutional racism just continue in almost every system you can think of. So we've seen it in COVID, and we've talked some about education here. And it's the fact that racism is institutionalized in our education system is layered and multifaceted. Part of it is not teaching history, purposefully leaving out a context. And then now we have plenty of legislators actually trying to put in law that things are not taught. And so the institution is hardened, right? This institution of racism is hardened. And I'm not even talking about the inequities of education in our country and how the tax codes shape the inequities of education in our country. And yes, I am an intersectional, living, breathing person. We all are. And I will say that what my identity and the identity I've passed to my children, my husband and I, that intergenerational DNA that we've passed, there is harm in their DNA. And we do what we can to give them these protective resources, including working within our community to make sure that people love them and know that we are a multiracial community. And there's two things. We cannot have thriving people. We cannot have a thriving society without correcting these harms. So correcting the harms of racism, and we have just really in these 3 sessions touched on those institutional harms. And so reparations is a way, one way to start teshuva, to start correcting some of those harms. And now I'm going to pose a question. One thing I hear often in our community, in the Jewish community, is that many Jews came after slavery. And so without having taken part in slavery, now from what I understand, the Jews who were here during slavery participated in slavery in the same proportionately. I know Ms. Taifa talked about how, of course, it wasn't just the South that benefited. But what do we say? What is there to say about folks who are saying, well, my ancestors, my family, we didn't move here until after that was over?
So let me just proffer a bit, if I may. That's absolutely correct. But the thing is that folk who came later nevertheless benefit from a society, from a state structure that is governed by white supremacy. And the benefits that are accrued and are gained are benefits that emanated from that time period. No one says that, listen, I did not participate in the in the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, but my tax dollars helped to pay that reparations. No one thinks about it like that, okay? But that is what the central scenario is. I'm part of this country. I participate in the debts as well as its assets. So it's part of the debt that is in it, that's part and parcel of being part of this country. And the fact that, again, the harms are still continuing. And I brought out, some of that, the wealth generation that's still going on today as a result of the foundation that was laid during the enslavement and the Jim Crow era. The fruits of all of that is what everyone is enjoying today. So that's my response.
Thank you. I would just add, from a liturgical perspective, we confess in first person plural. The Hebrew is first person plural, that there's a notion of collective responsibility. And when we list that long list of sins and we beat our chests on Yom Kippur, we're confessing not just for the sins that we ourselves participated in, that we can think of an event in the past year that we committed that particular sin, but we confess for the sins of our community. And I think that that's a really helpful paradigm for how we think about our collective obligation as Americans, for all of the reasons that Nkechi just said. We are the beneficiaries. White Jews are the beneficiaries, of course. And we bear responsibility. We bear a collective responsibility to right those wrongs.
Can I add one brief addition? I used to talk all the time. I hear what Mas Taifa said about you don't know until you know. I thought the myth that I grew up with, that my grandma Fanny, who was an incredible hero, she escaped the pogroms of Europe. She came here at age 16. She worked hard, did well, put my father through night school to become a lawyer, and the rest is history, except that it didn't take into account all of the structures and systems that, because she was white and entered into whiteness when she came here, and my father was white and I'm white, that we benefited everything from affordable housing, public financing of schools, I mean, building of wealth, and. So nobody should feel guilty, but we got to get organized and take responsibility for the reality. So I agree with Rabbi Goldstein in terms of the spiritual collective we, and there's also like the economic and systemic we that we have to take responsibility for.
Beautiful. We are now going to turn over to some of the questions participants have asked. So if you have a question, please go ahead and direct chat that to Ms. Lisa Tucker. Someone asked, as Ms. Taifa speaks about this moment of national attention, how do atonement and self-determination function as parts of reckoning with and redressing systemic racism?
Could you say it one more time, Deitra? Could you ask the
I
question?
agree. That was a big one.
Yes. So the question, Ms. Taifa speaks about this moment of national attention. How do atonement and self-determination function as parts of reckoning with and redressing systemic racism?
I'm gonna let the rabbis begin on that one.
Rabbi G, I'm looking at you. Look, I mean, I think Ms. Taifa, you probably have more to say on this than you're willing to admit. I think self-determination, look, all of Jewish tradition assumes that human beings have agency, right? We have agency, which means we can take responsibility for our actions and that we should have the space to determine our lives. And the sin of the kidnapping and forced enslavement of African people in the founding of the United States project stripped the humanity, the agency, it is the ultimate rejection of God, right? Because God, everybody's created in God's image, which means we all have the power to create and to have agency. So what's powerful about the reparations movement is it says, A, we're going to take responsibility for ourselves, those of us who are complicit with white supremacy and complicit with the systems of oppression, and we're going to join together across lines, and we're going to enable everybody then to be liberated and have self-determination. I think that reparations will free us all. That's why I get mad about the white farmers who are angry at the black farmers. This actually is in a modality of abundance, a way that we can all share in God's bounty. At least that's the way I think about it.
And let me just say one thing also, because a lot of times people think of reparations solely as an economic concept or to close the Black-white wealth gap. But when I look at the issue of self-determination, it is far, far, far more than that. In fact, one of you said, maybe it was Rabbi Goldstein, I'm not quite sure that, or maybe I've read it somewhere, I don't know, that even if the Black-white wealth gap is closed, there still is going to be racism, systemic racism, or white supremacy, you know, in the United States. The fact that at age 16, I'm looking through an African names book and picking an African name because I want to bring back some of my cultural identity and heritage. And I spelled the name, I pronounced the name wrong because I don't know the correct way to pronounce it because of the culture that was just stripped from me. That's part of it, you know, as well. So, you know, reparations is not just an economic concept, it's a cultural concept, it's a political concept. That's another whole story in and of itself, you know, and the like. So I think that all that is couched in the the doctrine of self-determination is, I always learn to define ourselves, name ourselves, speak for ourselves, instead of having other people do those things for us. So that was a big question. And I appreciate the person who asked it. And we're in the process of finding answers to all of these types of questions right now, when all this attention is on these issues. I just want to say, never did I believe, never, seriously, did I believe that we would even be at this point where the issue of reparations for the descendants of Africans enslaved in America would become a mainstream concept. Whether you agree with it or not, it is dinner table top conversation now. So I'm just thrilled to be at this very pivotal moment, and I hope that we don't let it pass without it happening.
Agreed. And I'd also like to add that one way, and I might flip the question a little bit and say atonement and self-determination. So if I am atoning as a collective we, as Rabbi Goldstein was just saying, and I have self-determination, to me that speaks to self-sacrifice. It speaks to looking at my own complicity in a system and really saying, what can I do? How can I determine teshuva? What tax code can I push for? How can I help pass reparations? So I'm not sure if that's what the questioner was saying, but that's, to me, that's how I am going to answer that question. Atonement and self-determination. I will atone with the collective we, and I will then determine what I can do to make reparations and restitution happen. Another question was talking about the resolution that the URJ passed is for HR 40, which is the study for reparations. So the questioner here, the participant is asking, isn't actually saying, calling for the need for reparations even one step further?
I would have to agree. I would say, yes, it is. It's a baby step. We should be taking leaps and bounds now, because actually the bill that was originally introduced was a bill that was just a study bill. But now it also is a bill to study and actually develop proposals for the Congress to consider. One must realize, when HR 40 was first introduced in 1989, it was modeled directly off of the Civil Liberties Act that had just passed in 1988 that granted reparations to the Japanese Americans. It was modeled off of that very strategically. It started out as a commission to study the issue, and then it came about dealing with what the actual remedy was. What happened when Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee took over the reins right after John Conyers passed, was that we collapsed the two. It's to study and develop proposals, because 30 years had already passed. 30 years, people. I mean, so yes, it is a step, and we're hoping that it will not just remain a step, but will become an actuality.
Just to add on to that, I sometimes roll my eyes about the Jewish tendency to respond to a social justice problem with a book club. Like, I think oftentimes we want to learn everything and to be as educated as possible about every dimension of an issue before we act. And I think it's important, as we talked about this afternoon, to educate and to see what happened and what continues to happen. That is critical. And education is just the first step. It is a means to action. And so my hope is that, and the resolution is one piece of this, but it's about so much more than just educating ourselves. It's about, using that as a tool to ignite people, to bring them into this work and to organize and to make more enduring and significant change.
And also there is something in the chat. There is an allied organization to one of the groups that I'm with. The allied organization is called Fund for Reparations Now. And it's an organization of white people who want to support in very concrete ways the quest for reparations for African Americans. And I think the information is right there in the chat. So I appreciate the person who put that there. Yeah, they have a wonderful website and very concrete ways for people to engage.
Deitra, one other quick thought too, for those on the call who are part of the Reform Jewish movement, every year we keep moving forward, so the agitation of that question is, should we be happy with the fact that we've called for the study of reparations? Now let's be calling for reparations. Many of you on this call are engaged and could propose such a resolution, but more to the point, I remember a few years ago when saying things like white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, systemic racism, like people would, not be so happy. And here we are having this conversation. So like Ms. Taifa, I love about you that like, we're making this kitchen table conversation. Now let's go to the next conversation. And so Rabbi Goldstein's right. We can't just do book group. We got to do action, but we also, got to keep moving people along, which is, slow but steady.
Slow and steady. We are at our time, pretty much. I want to thank each of you for being with us today. And I found this to be such a meaningful conversation and sacred dialogue, as Rabbi Pesner has been known to say. And so I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Pesner to close us. I want to thank also all of the participants.
Wow. Couple of things. One is, let me just say to Deitra, Reiser, I can't see you anymore. You disappeared, but thank you again. Thank you to Temple Sinai, DC. Thank you to Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills. And to all the folks, Yolanda Savage Narva, my wonderful colleague at the Union for Reform Judaism, who leads our racial equity, diversity, and inclusion work. This three-part series has been remarkable. Hundreds of people have gathered over these sessions to really make our commitment to racial justice a reality through focusing on not just studying reparations, but doing reparations. I'm posting in the chat a link to the racial justice campaign at the RAC. I'm also going to post in the chat a link to our work on reparations so that folks can really engage. We want to invite everybody on this call to roll up your sleeves. Many of you are part of the campaign. Many of you are doing the work at a congregational level, a communal level, at a state level, or at a federal level. But the fight is now for HR 40. There's a movement to put pressure on the Biden administration, conceivably to do some of what's in HR 40 as an executive order. So watch this space as the politics and the strategy evolve. Please stay engaged with us so that we can reach out and help you take action steps. There's a myriad ways in which folks who are on this call can take action. So click the links on reparations, click the links on the racial justice campaign. And I think, Deitra, having thanked you, having thanked Ms. Taifa, Rabbi Goldstein, having thanked you, Deitra Reiser, I would like to just end with a moment of prayer. Is that acceptable? So take a deep breath. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, God who is the God of our mothers and our fathers, our parents and our children. God who calls out to us in the voices of Sarah and Abraham, who saw the palace burning and said, Hineni, here I am, God. What is my role and my responsibility? God, we hear you in the voices of millennia of your children who have suffered, those who carry the intergenerational trauma, those who in the United States are the descendants of those Africans who were enslaved and kidnapped and endured 400 years of systemic racism. The Jewish call to justice, to teshuvah, is your ancient, thousands-year-old call to live Jewish tradition, to see the divine in all, and to live the teshuvah, the repair that is possible. Let us join in fulfilling your vision for a world in which all people experience justice, and wholeness. And yes, God, equity. Equity. That is our work. That is our commitment. We are your children. May we all go forth with peace and blessing from strength to strength. Amen.